So it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Tawney lecturer, Professor Harold James. Harold is professor in European Studies, History, and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's an expert on financial history and the history of globalization. He's authored literally countless books, and I did try to count, but I wasn't confident that I would have included them all, so I decided not to put a number on it. But to give a few highlights, his book, The German Slump, was a seminal contribution on the Great Depression in Germany, explaining why the Great Depression was so severe in Germany. His book, The End of Globalization, studied the breakdown of the pre-World War I globalization during the interwar period, and has been translated into 8 languages. More recently, he's worked on the euro and the structure of the European Monetary Union, and on the recent history of the Bank of England. And he's also the official historian of the IMF, so this is, very august person. So today, Harold will speak to us on inflation and globalization. These are 2 topics that are ongoing or of ongoing or rediscovered relevance, and Harold will explain how the 2 are connected. So please join me in welcoming Professor Harold James.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that Catherine Schenk wasn't here to talk last night, and I missed Catherine. I should also say thank you so much for the kind introduction, but you oblige me to point out that what I'm going to say is strictly my own interpretation and my own views, and doesn't reflect in any way the view of the International Monetary Fund. It's a real honor to have been invited to give the Tawney lecture this year. R.H. Tawney was an intellectual giant who consistently attempted something so bold as inevitably to provoke those fierce, antagonistic demolition crews that haunt our modern academic life. His most celebrated book, the best-selling historical book of its time, and I think it's been in print ever since it was published, was later characterized with, I don't know, it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, by the Cambridge historian Geoffrey Elton as having some claims to being one of the most harmful books written in the years between the wars. As Elton put it, his history was not good, not sound, not right, not true. And Tawney had been unfairly protected from just censure in Elton's view, because he was a nice man, partly because he wrote so well, and partly because he seemed to invest historical study with moral and social purposes. Well, I think all of those 3 things are actually what historians and economists should aim at. They should be aiming at being good people and at writing well, and also to give moral and social purposes to history. Elton thought that Tawney had been the originator of a malign wokery that persuaded generations of Englishmen that everything that contributed to the greatness and success of their country derived from selfish sinfulness and money-grubbing wickedness. Elton went on to explain in some detail why Tawney's book has greatly assisted in the decline of Protestant self-confidence and the consequent revival of Roman Catholicism, in the reaction against capitalism as an economic system, and perhaps even in the West's increasing inclination to relinquish world leadership. Tawney seemed to invite rebuke. I could have quoted the Oxford and then Cambridge historian Hugh Trevor-Roper, who also seemed to take a particular animadversion to R.H. Tawney. The ambition of Tawney's great book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, was to demonstrate a linkage between 2 phenomena that indisputably molded early modern Europe. Both Max Weber and Tawney dealt, and both were red flags to the brigade of British empiricists, with a profound question of causation. Assessing what can provide a demonstration of causal influence is a notoriously intractable problem for our discipline that standard statistical tests often handle badly and inconsequentially. Weber's famous answer to this question presented ideas as setting the switches for the development of material forces along a fixed track. For Tawney, the thought that a Protestant ethic drove a spirit of rationality that mutated readily into providentialist accumulationism seemed wrong on simply chronological grounds, because the early reformers, Luther and Calvin, were after all distinctly anti-capitalist. So Tawney reversed the causal arrow and suggested in an apparently Marxist manner that the changes in the intellectual superstructure had been driven by the transformation of the economic substructure, or that a nascent mercantile capitalism created a dynamic in which its adherents relegated the profound and encompassing moral vision of the medieval church, which Tawney somewhat idealized, and also of the reformers, into nothing more than a handy ancillary of their sordid commercial practice. There are then two issues which Tawney clearly and provocatively laid out. First, the demand for historical practice to ascertain a clear causal relationship, and secondly, a downplaying of the world of ideas in that causal process. Tawney was far from applying a mechanistic Marxism, and that was an approach indeed for which he had little sympathy. In a key passage of Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, he brings us to the theme of the investigation that I want to go through with you this afternoon. For Tawney's century, I think Trevor Roper coined that term, 1550 to 1650, was both the era of the price revolution and the era of the rise of a new kind of globalized capitalism. Tawney saw with luminous clarity the links, and they were also links between Tawney's century and the world of the early 1920s in which he was writing. And maybe it applies also, I think, to the very uncertain experience that we're having in 2022. So I'd like to just read this passage from Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. In the half-century which followed the Reformation, thanks to the collapse of sterling on the international market, as a result of depreciated currency, war, and a foreign debt contracted on ruinous terms, the state of the foreign exchanges was the obsession of publicists and politicians. Problems of currency and credit lend themselves more readily than most economic questions to discussion in terms of mechanical causation. It was in the long debate provoked by the rise of the prices and the condition of the exchanges that the psychological assumptions, which were afterwards to be treated by economists as of self-evident and universal validity, were first hammered out. So this is the story of Tawney's century. This is the consumer price inflation index from the Bank of England's Millennium of Economic Data database. And you can see that it was really a remarkable contrast with what went before and what went after. And the Tudor debate about prices generated new psychological and political assumptions. That's a long way removed from any crude determinism. And I want to show quite how useful a model that approach is when it comes to examining the foundations of modern globalization. Tawney knew how deeply his war-shocked audience in the early 1920s cared about the collapse of sterling and the state of foreign exchanges. So now I come to a modern controversy, the relationship between globalization and inflation. It's conducted, I think, more politely than the hysterical and tub-thumping criticisms that Tawney seemed so readily to provoke, but it's intense nonetheless. Over the past 50 years, there's been an equally protracted debate to that on the rise of prices in the 16th century, and that also produces, I think, a broader reflection about causality, about policy links. By the early 21st century, policymakers and academics thought that they could detect a relationship between globalization and a transition to a low inflation regime across the world. First in rich industrial countries, and then in emerging markets, in Asia, first of all, but ultimately also in Latin America, where inflation had been a way of life, or seemed to have been a way of life. In 2005, the chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, explained that globalization, coupled with technical innovation, would appear to be essential elements of any paradigm capable of explaining the events of the past 10 years, i.e. the Great Moderation, the so-called Great Moderation. As Greenspan put it, because of deregulation, increased innovation, and lower barriers to trade and investment, cross-border trade in recent decades has been expanding at a faster pace than GDP. As a result, many economies are increasingly exposed to the rigors of international competition and comparative advantage. In the process, lower prices for some goods and services produced by our trading partners have competitively suppressed domestic price pressures. The Fed's view remained substantially unchanged, and in 2021 even, Greenspan's successor, Jay Powell, was still referring to sustained disinflationary forces, including technology, globalization, and perhaps demographic factors. This view became also, I think, embedded in the academic literature, though actually surprisingly late. Kristen Forbes has a summary of the state of the debate in 2019 and concludes that global factors should no longer play an ancillary role in models of inflation dynamics. She thought it's necessary to incorporate global factors in the models, including global slack, non-fuel commodity prices, as well as oil prices, the exchange rate, global price competition. Charles Goodhart and Manoy Pradhan list globalization along with underlying structural trends, demography, and the macroeconomic balance between savings and investment as the interacting forces that produced this low inflation, apparently sustained low inflation outcome. So the factors of production, labor, capital, look as if they're both globalized. The savings investment balance is a global one in this view, not a national peculiarity. A paper for the ECB, the recent strategy review, concludes that headline inflation rates have become more synchronized globally, largely because commodity prices are increasingly determined by global factors. And if you think that capital is doing this, and that's the view from the ECB, it's also clear, I think, and I'll come to a more detailed discussion of that later, that the labor market dynamics are changed by the availability of, in practice, a global labor force, and that changes the way that we should think, for instance, of the Phillips curve. The neo-Tawneyites argued that this reduction in inflation came because of the globalization in trade and migration, generating consistent downward pressure on wages. If you think what an updated Weber view would be, or a neo-Weberian view, you would instead say that this was the result of a global intellectual shift, the victory of an idea, what's often discussed as neoliberalism, that spread around the world as the Washington Consensus. But both camps would, I think, agree that global influences were dominating monetary policy and monetary behavioral outcomes. But I shouldn't leave you with the impression that this is a unanimous view. And there are many people who pushed back against it. So let me give you an example. Economist Lawrence Ball very usefully broke down this discussion into three questions. Has globalization reduced the long-run level of inflation? Has it affected the structure of inflation dynamics, as summarized by the Phillips curve? Has it contributed substantial negative shocks to the inflation process? And he then gave a very, very pithy answer to that. A short summary of the answers is no, no, and no. I think that this debate got fundamentally truncated because it didn't adequately take into account the historical periodization in the relationship of inflation and globalization at the outset of the new globalization process. And hence it doesn't think seriously about the social and intellectual history that might chart the transmutation of an intense concern with prices, that was Tawney's world in the early 1920s, an intense concern on prices, with the broad psychological and political shifts. The modern assessments depended on the assumption that recent globalization, as defined by the increased flow of capital, goods, and people, only really came in the 1990s and the 2000s. And some people give as a date for the chronology of modern globalization China's entry into the WTO in 2001. But that was after the transition to a monetary policy regime that revolved around a low inflation target in most industrial countries. But Ball, I think, was correct about this, that the surge in world trade as a share of world output occurred in the 1970s, in a high inflation era. Such a reading of the globalization story would lead to a very different set of answers to Lawrence Ball's questions. And I want to say yes, yes, and yes. Modern globalization appears as two or perhaps 2.5 distinct episodes. And this figure, it's a nice figure that Katow and Obstfeld produced a few years ago, shows the story very well. What's thought of now, I think, as the first modern age of globalization began in the middle of the 19th century. It was interrupted by the First World War, after which there was a desperate attempt to revive globalization with a more robust institutional framework in what you might think of as a half episode that quickly failed with the Great Depression, or what I called, and Eric kindly referred to that book, the end of globalization. And then in the 1970s, a new globalization took off. The antithesis of globalization can be found in periods of conflict and war, when economic advantage appears as a zero-sum game and a fiscally driven inflation drives up prices. That was the background of Tawney's century, dominated by the clash of Habsburg Spain and Valois France, but also of the great wars of the mid-19th century, the Crimea, and then the wars of German, Italian, and US unification. 20th century world wars interrupted globalization. Some recent commentators try to redescribe interwar catastrophe as the global 1930s, the global 30s. I'm not really convinced about that. I think it should be clearly stated that it was violence, war, and deglobalization that in that profoundly dishonest decade became globally compelling political phenomena. And there are obviously fears that we're living in a repetition of that kind of era, and you can, I think, see distinct parallels to the story of the aggression of Nazi Germany and the difficulty of Britain and France in dealing with that, with the difficulty that we face in dealing with Vladimir Putin's aggression. Globalization reduced in the end inflation levels, both in the 19th century, when there's a stark contrast between the third quarter of the century with dramatic price surges during business cycle upturns and the generally deflationary and subdued experience of the period from 1873 to 1896, and also then in the late 20th century. And that alters the Philip curve dynamic of the trade-off between inflation and employment. History can illuminate the stages of the disinflationary process and its mechanism. Both the mid-19th century and the late 20th century globalizations can, I think, in some ways be described as and explained as technologically driven. And some of the most important productivity gains involved the reduction of the cost of transport. It's the steam engine that drove the opening up of continents with railroads and oceans with steamships. It's the container that reduced the cost of transporting goods after the 1970s. But if you think about the steamship and the steam engine, and I saw there was a paper, I missed it in this meeting. If you think of the steamship or the container, they're actually very old innovations at the time that they come to be so revolutionary. Boulton and Watt were, after all, experimenting in the 1770s with the steam engine, and the ship that's usually supposed to be the first container ship, the auto carrier, was launched in 1931. And it then required a specific set of circumstances to realize the transformative character of the innovation. And that was the environment that price disruptions produced. Policy choices are involved in that, the removal of impediments to commerce, but also consensus around a stable and internationally applicable monetary framework, whether it's the gold standard or a modern inflation targeting regime. So let me talk then about those two episodes more precisely, the 1840s and the 1970s. In each case, the transformation, the beginning of the globalization push, was driven by a fear of scarcity and its political consequences. The 1840s is the decade of hunger, of agrarian as well as industrial crisis. Europe, on its way to becoming the most dynamic part of the world economy, experienced a powerful negative supply shock with famine, malnutrition, disease, and revolt. And it's the lessons that are derived from that experience. And I think Charles Reed is in the audience, and Charles has been writing about this very nicely. The lessons that are drawn from that arise because of the dramatic role that foreign imports of grain played in satisfying urgent food needs at a moment of crisis. That crisis wasn't one that could have been anticipated, and it's easy, I think, to show, and Cormac O'Grady dealt with that very nicely, that the analysis of price fluctuations in the first half of the 19th century suggests that the complete failure of the potato crop was an outlandish event that was far out of the range of actual or likely Western European experience. So it's a surprise. And it's followed then by epidemic disease, by typhus and then by cholera. The food crisis led to a demand for increased imports, provoking a trade crisis to which policy responded. The Bank of England, reacting to the gold drain in accordance with the rules laid down just recently in the 1844 Peel Act, increased its discount rate, a move that was expected to bring in foreign gold, but it also made it more expensive and difficult for businesses to borrow and more costly for the government to borrow as well. The measure thus led to a manufacturing shutdown. The government feared that borrowing to pay for the new crisis expenditures would impose strains on the capital market and drive up interest rates even higher. It would then be costlier to finance any government relief, and larger deficits would worsen the general panic. Countering the panic, then, disastrously, involved fiscal retrenchment on the part of the government. That was the second and devastating policy response, with catastrophic human effects. In the wake of those disasters, governments needed to reinvent themselves so as to see their relationship with commercial prosperity in a new way. And they asked a completely new kind of question. what is good government? Some analysts of globalization, notably Kevin O'Rourke, have envisaged a definition of politics as a result, which says that politics we can conceive of as simply a measurement of the gap between the technological possibilities and the amount of global integration achieved. On this metric, politics became notably better after 1850. The events of the 1840s laid the foundation for a wave of productive institutional adaptation designed to remedy coordination problems raised by the multiplicity of small states in Europe with limited powers to deal with mobility. So the result was the creation of the nation state, new constitutions in Germany, Italy, the administrative reform of the Habsburg Empire with the Constitutional Compromise of 1867. In the great 19th century wars, and I think you should think of them as in even a broader context, including the US Civil War and the opening of Japan with the Meiji Restoration, can be seen in this context of a nation building which emphasized the effectiveness and the capacity of institutions. And there are, I think, very precise linkages with the European crisis. So the emigration from Europe reaches its peak in the 1850s. Emigration from Germany was a peak in 1854, in precisely the year that Kansas, the state of Kansas, has been declared open to free settlement. The surge of German and Scandinavian immigration into Kansas ensured that Kansas would become a free rather than a slave-owning state. And in this way, it undid the careful constitutional compromise of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and in doing that, helped to set the switches for civil war. It's also, I think, right to think of these disturbances in the middle of the 19th century as leading in the aftermath to monetary expansion. In part, the story is told often in the context of the California gold rush and then the Australian rush in 1851. But it's also to do with innovation in banking, the innovation of the Crédit Mobilier, and then the spread of analogous institutions throughout Europe. And in consequence, very quickly, Europe looked much less likely to experience a repeat of the simultaneous move that it had had in 1848 to political revolution. There are new opportunities, and the big one is trade liberalization. It's given a model or template in the form of the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, the 1860 Anglo-French Agreement, and migration takes off after the political revolutions. So contemporaries begin then to celebrate the meaning of trade policy for political stability, both domestic and international, because the idea at that time, very, very heavily dogmatically propounded by the great British free traders, Bright and Cobden, was that free trade would make for political stability. That's the view that's celebrated in 1851 at the Great Exhibition. Business is also revolutionized through new corporate forms, the limited liability joint stock company, and we have then a story in which we have monetary and price surges in the 1850s that are closely correlated with the business cycle, with dramatic spikes in 1852 to 3, 1860 to 1, 1866, that are also reflected in asset prices. And look at the contrast between that and the later 19th century, when price spikes are much more modest and globalization altered price variability. The new stability, I think, is also bolstered by the near universal move to the gold standard as countries sought a credibility mechanism that would allow them to attract capital inflows or to globalize even further. Globalization looks as if it wins the day in this chart. Well, that's really exactly the counterpart to what happened in the 1970s. There's the same long cycle. an initial inflation, then a push to globalize to alleviate scarcity, and then a long period of disinflation. The great inflation of the 60s and 70s began with economic overheating. The outcome was to produce widespread shortages and price hikes, and confidence in government was destroyed in the same way as it was destroyed in the 1840s. In the 60s, there had been a generalized optimism about how human society could be controlled and directed, and that optimism was directed to ensuring that economies would fire on all cylinders, that a little bit more growth could be squeezed out of the mechanism, and there was hubris in the belief that governments could achieve their objectives. So the defining economic parameters that bred pessimism in the 1970s and malaise lay domestically. But the driver is a widespread belief in the capacity of economic growth to raise productivity, to make more growth, and to push down prices as a result of productivity gains. A highly influential model, and again, it's nice to talk about this in Cambridge, was evolved by Nicholas Kaldor, who looked at the long-term relationship between technical progress and the rate of growth and derived a technical progress function. An increased manufacturing sector would lead to a self-sustaining virtuous cycle of higher rates of growth and hence also of higher wages. And Roy Harrod then pushed this even further and drew the logical consequence that stronger demand growth would reduce inflation rather than augment inflation. So the stronger demand grows, the more you lower prices. But it's exactly that worldview that's shattered in the 1970s. The story, I think, is familiar of the way in which the 60s and 70s debate was framed in terms of the Phillips curve. In the original version, the relationship was between wages and employment. High growth or rising employment would generate a shortage of workers, and wage pressure would then be translated into rising prices. An economic shock, on the other hand, would reduce the demand for employment, lead to a wage mitigation, and a lower pace of price increases. For the world's major industrial economies, the relationship could clearly be empirically demonstrated through the 1970s. But in the 1970s, wages continued to move up, even though there was substantial unemployment. Keynes's theory of adjustment depended on irrational or arbitrary behavior of wage earners, who in the original version suffered from a nominal wage illusion. They didn't notice that inflation was eroding their real incomes, and the lower wages generated then higher levels of employment. Milton Friedman and Edward Phelps, in different ways, showed how unemployment depended on real wages and how inflation could camouflage the real movements of wages and prices. In the nominal illusion, as the nominal illusion faded with high levels of inflation, a new answer to the adjustment question was required, and wage settlements could only be constrained by discipline in the form of the imposition of guidelines or controls. So the majority view is the position of the Phillips curve shifts and its shape alters. The curve is shifting upwards and to the right in the 1970s. But from the 1980s, with output no longer seen in a purely national context, increased demand no longer necessarily pushed prices up. The curve flattened and moved downwards. In the longer term then, some commentators would extrapolate the new logic with the claim that there's a natural rate of unemployment consistent with any level of inflation, and thus that the curve is in fact vertical. The confusion between short-term reactions and long-term theories led to the conclusion that the curve was dead. Either the flat position or the vertical versions reflected a kind of rigor mortis. There was further uncertainty as calculations of a natural or non-accelerating rate of unemployment showed a steep fall in the 1990s, with the suggestion that technical shifts would alter the dynamics of the labor market. The new Phillips curve relationship was also a consequence of the underappreciated consequence of transformative technical and economic change. New technologies allowed new production, as well as a shift of production of goods and services in rich countries. But the labor for the new activities isn't instantly available, and a substantial transfer of people from one area to another is incompatible with the policy emphasis on full employment. The problem, I think, is most acutely diagnosed, not for the case of Western market economies, but in the world of Soviet planning, where the great Hungarian economist János Kornai analyzed how there could be no real economic system from which both excess demand and excess supply had been eliminated. Optimization, he wrote, is not possible. We want full employment, but we do not want labor shortage. They are joint products which, it seems, necessarily appear together. In the 1970s, the arguments and responses about the inflation problem are mostly domestic. But the responses lay in external policy, how the national economy related to the rest of the world. And the United States led the way. In August 1971, President Nixon dramatically ended the gold convertibility of the dollar, which at that time was restricted already to official institutions, and imposed a 90-day freeze on wage and prices and a 10% surcharge on imports to ensure that American products will not be at a disadvantage because of unfair exchange rates. So the answer lies in protection. That's, I think, most dramatic, and the debate is most dramatic in the UK and indeed here in Cambridge. The balance of payments constraint appeared earlier than elsewhere in the UK. The government tried a Buy British campaign that was supported by all the major political parties. Leaders encouraged citizens to wear stickers and badges with the Union Jack and the message, "I'm backing Britain." You know, I remember this as a school child. There were these stickers that everybody was wearing, "I'm backing Britain." And the press magnate, Robert Maxwell, distributed T-shirts with the same slogan, "I'm backing Britain." And then there was a kind of embarrassment when it was discovered that the T-shirts were printed in Portugal. In the middle of the 1970s, with a really high rate of inflation, and showed the inflation rates there. The colors are a bit mixed, but I think you can see the really enormous British spike in the middle 1970s. In 1975, it's just below 25%, the CPI. There's a policy debate. Do you want a siege economy with extensive import restrictions? But the same kind of pressure is occurring in the United States. There's a lot of anxiety about Japanese competition. Here, the intellectual case, I think, is made over and over again by the Department of Applied Economics, and especially by its director, Wynne Godley. Just a quotation, in 1975, the Economic Policy Review said that there seems to be no way of obtaining simultaneously an improvement in the current balance and keeping unemployment below 1 million, other than by introducing some form of import restriction. But this extreme advice wasn't heeded, and there was then an intellectual and analytical shift. And indeed, by the early 1980s, after the second oil shock following the Iranian Revolution, the Cambridge view shifted to focus on the international system as a whole, with the argument that higher oil prices, and indeed commodity prices in general on an elevated level, would be a way to promote a new sort of growth. This figure, I think, shows the degree of divergence in inflation performance in the 1970s, and then the astonishing story of convergence afterwards. Germany looks like an outlier with low inflation rates, even in stability-oriented Switzerland. There's a higher inflation rate than in Germany. And the inflation rate and the difference in inflation is really linked fundamentally to the way in which policymakers thought of how the response to the commodity shock should be organized. If you want to adjust very quickly to the policy shock, you need to reduce demand very quickly because people are paying more for the imported energy. If, on the other hand, you think that you should buffer that cost and that this is a temporary measure, then fundamentally you don't encourage the consumers to change their behavior. So in the 1970s, the United States thought primarily in terms of a temporary moment of shock. And so the important thing to do is to compensate for it, not to adjust to it. So there was the gasoline prices were held down. There was no incentive to have more fuel-efficient cars, and only really late in the decade, in the Carter presidency, is there a move in the other direction. The reaction to this divergence is that there's a new field of policy debate. What went wrong? Was it political pressure? Was it wrong policy? Was it incorrect theory? And the dramatic moment at the end of the 1970s is when the US and UK axis turns from being at the top of the international range of inflation outcomes to becoming then centers of stability. But the disinflation is a long and painful process. And as in the 19th century, the internationalization of banking, the liberalization of capital movements, the emergence of a broad sweep of new banking activities initially pushed the surge in inflation as well. So it's a real dilemma. And so I think this does produce, in the same way as the 1840s and 50s did, a kind of paradox. Why is it that the oil shock in the end creates more globalization rather than the turn to economic nationalism, which might have been thought of as the most obvious immediate response, and which Nixon sort of automatically jumped at in 1971 already, before the big oil surge. So there are a number of things going on. There's a mechanism that's driving the new linkages in the form of a financial revolution, which transferred the large surpluses accumulated by their oil producers into lendable funds in big international banks, the development of international capital markets, offshore, thus largely free of direct government control, was the major financial innovation of the period. The availability of money made resources available for governments all over the world that wanted to push development and growth, and demand surged then. And the alternative strategies looked like a mechanism that would cut off access to markets and prosperity. So it's in this environment that, for instance, the container revolution takes over. Container ports, they're already there, but they're not really used until the 1970s. It's only in 1973 that containers transported more of US cargo than traditional breakbulk ships. And in the 1970s, increased competition, the pressure of shippers on the carriers drove down prices. New technologies, energy-efficient production of automobiles in Japan in particular, where the US, the UK, are rather slow. But I think the same process of opening through competition is evident elsewhere. I think one other interesting indication is the way that in a famous wine tasting in 1976, when 9 French judges are weighing the qualities of competing top products, American wines outclassed French wines in both whites and red. And the American press loved to cover this event. The French wine producers were humiliated. But what I think you see is that there's a new trend of looking to models elsewhere and thinking, what can we learn from that? How can we improve? And that's exactly what trade opening does. And it's maybe unsurprising that the United States came slow to this process. Learning is always more difficult for countries that think of themselves as hegemonic, and Paul Krugman likes to comment that as a nation, we Americans are often unwilling to learn from foreign experience. But the 1970s made that process of learning from foreign experience absolutely essential. So the crisis produces the same realization as in the 1840s. Openness creates resilience. Financing needs to be available for trade to expand. And the eventual impact is, I think, obvious if you look at the figure right at the beginning on trade and output. It applies across the world. So even where there's no large-scale borrowing, countries are managing this kind of openness. So India and China, the 2 countries that increasingly would set the terms of a new globalization, started their move to openness in exactly this period. Younger Indian economists, most prominently Jagdish Bhagwati, developed the criticism of the rent-seeking behavior caused by lobby groups, special interests who could profit from restrictions on international trade. But at that time, there isn't the political momentum yet, and it's only in the 1990s that Manmohan Singh, as finance minister, starts to ask, what does South Korea have that India doesn't? And then starts to lay out the program of opening and reform. But the most dramatic moment of all is the turn of China and the ascendancy of Deng Xiaoping. When Deng visits Singapore in November 1978, he's impressed by the openness, the modernity, and starts to think how exactly that foreign model could be applied, and reflected later on how Singapore's social order is good. Its leaders exercise strict management. We should learn from their experience, and we should do a better job than they do. So these moments of globalization are moments of learning. All these expansions, all these liberalizations, all these openings were launched with initially high levels of inflation. And they're produced by expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, as well also as the financial innovation. And I think that is worth reflecting on. Inflation may initially have made the adjustments in production easier because relative prices could move more easily without provoking fears of price and wage cuts, at least as long as there was some nominal wage illusion remained. Once that disappears, inflation then generates only confusion about prices and uncertainty and investment for the future. But even, for instance, the famous Big Bang operations in the transformation after the collapse of the planned economies in Central Europe, they operate with initially very, very high levels of inflation. And Leszek Balcerowicz, who is the pioneer of this story in Poland, really pushes the inflation at the beginning as a way of tackling a system of prices that has become artificial and rigid. And then you see now the opening to a globalization in which demand is met by supplies that are produced by a global labor pool, and that constrains the labor bargaining power. Interests are interest rates are pushed down by a global capital pool. And responding to those two new phenomena raised new questions about how policy should be formulated. Does scarcity inevitably produce inflation? Of course it doesn't. It dramatically changes, what scarcity does is dramatically change relative prices, but not the overall price level. But then inflation becomes a policy solution, an attractive way of meeting the challenges of scarcity. It's, I suppose, true in a banal way that this famous Milton Friedman quote that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But we really need to explain more. And I think thinking back to Tawney's century is helpful. Then inflation was both a consequence of the bullion inflow from the New World, the famous explanation of Al Hamilton, but it also comes from a society of scarcity, hunger, and poverty that comes after the 16th century population rise. The great inflations of the 20th century, occurring at moments of scarcity in and after the First World War, that's the first big surge of inflation, as well as in the 1970s, in the aftermath of the long economic boom, can be explained easily in terms of the modern language of fiscal dominance. The budget of the state is so committed to a large amount of debt service that it compels the monetary authority to monetize debt and drive down interest rates. That logic is most apparent in cases of major military conflict when monetary policy becomes subordinated to overriding national priorities. It's also, I think, in evidence after the substantial expansion of government debt in response to the 2008 global financial crisis, which set a trap from which escape is difficult. But there's also a parallel operation to this fiscal dominance story to what's sometimes called financial dominance, where the financial sector or the business community has amassed so much debt that monetary authorities are compelled to monetize in order to prevent an avalanche of corporate bankruptcy and failure. That additional driver of inflation, I think, might be expected to be a phenomenon of the recent wave of financial globalization, and it was exemplified by the Greenspan put, the idea that the stock market provided a central guide for Fed policy, that the stock market provided the central indicator for the Fed. There might then be a strong cause to be made about causality, that inflation helped to create a new policy environment. As the costs of inflation become clearer and the political choices become more politically costly, looking for ways of calming inflationary pressures becomes more attractive again. But the disinflationary cure is always temporarily highly uncomfortable. Milton Friedman again puts it like this: inflation is just like alcoholism. In both cases, when you start drinking or when you start printing too much money, the good effects come first. That's why in both cases there's a strong temptation to overdo it, to drink too much or to print too much money. How to wean the patient off the battle? Would a change in what the monetary policy doctor prescribed suffice? Actually, it's globalization that comes in here like a kind of cold water bath that you jump into to tackle the bad hangover. It may be that the best explanations lie in terms of a broader social pact that requires inflation at one moment and then goes into retreat from that position. Inflationary outcomes are often initially seen as a cheap or convenient way of diffusing social tension, preserving employment in a fragile political setting, as in Europe after the First World War, or in a global crisis of democracy and legitimacy in the 1970s. And then it was exactly that moment that there was a lot of this discussion of whether inflation is a way of papering over social divisions. There was a beautiful book by Fred Hirsch and John Goldthorpe on that. But a lot of that story of getting the positive employment effects of inflation clearly depend on it being unanticipated. And when the inflation expectations become endemic and the agents price in the anticipation of future inflation, the positive effects disappear and the negative effects, above all, increases in inequality, appear, and inflation then becomes simply a regressive tax. Such a move, however, requires the creation of not just a new intellectual framework, but also a broader anti-inflationary or stability consensus. And it's only a new and widely held belief system that can break, as it were, the social dominance, the third wing of the inflation-pushing strategy, along with fiscal dominance, along with financial dominance. It's only then that social dominance gets revised. And I think that is, in large part, the story of the late 20th century. And it occurs internationally. When central banks are doing the new monetary policy, they're often arguing that they're doing that because they're acting in conformity with an international globalized trend. There's what was often discussed as a brotherhood of central banks. In the extreme case in Europe, the new central bank is shared with others. But even where there's inflation targeting, it relies on the observation of experience in other places. Mervyn King, the figure who is really responsible for this move in the UK from the 1990s onwards, puts it like this. It's, after all, much easier to lose weight, he said, when one's own family members are on the same diet. And so the world is going into a coherent moment of dieting or fasting. Inflation, that was initially a response to shortages, solved nothing at all. And the discontents it generated led to a change of course, a wider geographic sourcing of needed products. Trade opening is, in the 19th century and the late 20th century, a way of supplying more supplies of goods that will benefit more the average consumer. So is the search for currency stability. Globalization is, in this sense, a response to the constraints created by supply shocks and to the political destabilization that they produce. That brings us back to Tawney's century. Globalization arises from a mindset, the psychological consequences of that phrase that Tawney had, of a depreciated currency, war, and, in the case of many countries at least, a foreign debt contracted on ruinous terms, in which the state of the foreign exchanges becomes the obsession of publicists and politicians. So there may be carefully worked out theoretical expositions, as in this famous tract of Jean Baudin from 1568, the path-breaking essay, the Réponse au paradoxe du sieur de Maladroit, or in the 19th century by John Stuart Mill, or in the 20th by Milton Friedman, but they're never completely sound intellectual underpinnings, as I think the debate about the character and the shift of the Phillips curve demonstrates. Rather, the realization of policy, of a new policy, depends on a gut choice driven by large interests that are in favor of connections. So if you go back to this Weber and Tawney dichotomy, ideas and interests are actually reinforcing each other. When realized, the globalization process produces a benign global price deflation, as in the late 19th century or the early 21st century. But that creates its own instabilities, its new searches for new assets, high yields, and an incipient tendency to destabilize. It's tempting then to return to Tawney and to think of the development as sinful, money-grubbing, and indeed the moral and moralizing quality that's so characteristic of Tawney's verdict appears copiously in contemporary analyses of a world that's racked by inequality. Tawney, too, wondered about what he called the modern temper, which had much more affinity with the rage of the medieval burgess at the uncharitable covetousness of the usurer and the engrosser than it has with the confidence reposed by its innocent grandfathers in the infallible operations of the invisible hand. In short, modern globalization, the story up here, puts us back in the snare of Tawney's causal mechanism. The hands that produced inflation weren't at all invisible, and I believe it's the historian's task to make them visible to posterity. Thank you.